Casting with Ceri Jones.
This week, I travelled down to Pembrokeshire to meet up with saltwater fishing guide Vaughan Thomas. Vaughan and I have fished together for around 10 years. During that time, he has taken me to his favourite marks where we have had great success, catching bass, mullets, pollock, as well as sea trout. Vaughan shares his passion for the sea, as surfer and fly fisherman, his knowledge of tides and swells, and his love for year-round saltwater fishing. Well, I got to start by saying it's a real joy to come down to your manor. You really live in a lovely place.
Thank you, Ceri. It's always a pleasure to see you as well.
How long have you been here down in Pembrokeshire?
25 years now. Well, it'll be 25 years with my wife next year, so probably a bit longer, 26 years. Came down on a whim, really.
And where were you before then?
Gower. I was working in Crofty Industrial Estate. Long story. I'd found out that I'd had a brain hemorrhage previously and decided that I was unfit to operate machinery. So I lost my job and various other things overnight, and thought, well, I'd been surfing in Pembrokeshire for a few years and thought, well, that's a nice place to go. And I knew a few people and just came down on a whim for a break and basically never came back.
So it's the surfing which actually brought you here?
Yeah,
initially.
Surfing, even though... fishing is probably my main love of life. Yeah. Surfing was already getting busy on Gower, and Pembrokeshire, there was literally a handful of surfers about. And I thought, it's a beautiful coastline, saw plenty of opportunity for fishing as well. Everyone thought I was mad, thought I wouldn't make a living down here. But before long, I ended up as a postman. And got to know the area extremely well, and met my wife, and yeah.
Were you a fisherman before coming here?
Oh yeah. No, I've been fishing since I was 4 or 5 years old. I grew up on the River Team in Ludlow, so I cut my teeth on catching brown trout and grayling, and also chub and dace, and various other coarse fish. I spent a lot of time on Gower in my childhood as well. So started sea fishing when I was probably 6 years old. And there wasn't really much surfing going on then. There wasn't really any wetsuits or anything. So fishing was our main hobby. From about the age of 11, I was catching bass. But we were mainly using bait, so peeler crab on a float.
It was we then? As your dad or something, was it?
My father and my brother. And we had great success. We used to do a bit of spinning for mackerel. Soon after, I started fly fishing when I was about 11 on the River Team. But previous to that, I'd been making flies. I'd been tying flies for catching mackerel, because you couldn't buy mackerel traces as you do now. You had to, make do what you had. Kit was expensive, and you just made do whatever you could muster up. So yeah. I started actually tying flies without a vice, just in my finger and thumb, and then grew a love for fly fishing.
Mackerel feathers, then that was
basically, yeah. And I managed to get hold of when I was about 13. I managed to get hold of, which was quite unusual for the time, but it was a Daiwa. It was one of their first carbon rods, but it was a 9-weight. So it could cope with these larger flies. And I remember trying hard back then to catch mackerel and garfish, basically. Bass were...
On a fly rod?
On a fly rod, yeah.
Yeah.
But it didn't really take off. So equipment wasn't advancing. Like a lot of things in the States, they'd been using the fly for forever, basically, in salt water. And the things like soft plastic lures. I remember being out there in the early 80s, and they were commonplace whereas it's only in the last few years here now. So we're talking almost 30 years or more difference before we're starting to catch up. And saltwater fly fishing is now as a recognised sport, and the equipment is there to do it now.
When did you start? Because you're doing guiding on the coastline now.
A lot of people ask to be taken fishing and shown how to fish. And I thought, well, there's an opportunity here. You know, I've put time served. You know, I've put a lot of my life into angling, and the knowledge that I've got is not from books. It's from actually going out there with an Ordnance Survey map, studying the tides, and actually putting the time in, whether it's on the river, lakes, or the sea. So I thought, well, there's an opportunity there to guide people, because some people will not want to put that time in, especially if they're on holiday.
More so, I suppose you need a guide more than the lake, because there's only so much bank in the lake. But with the sea's a big place, isn't it?
The sea's a big place, and you've got
tides.
You've got an infinite amount of variations. Whereas, so you start with a river. You've got, if it's in spate, well, you can still fish it. If it's on its knees in lows of summer, you can still fish it. If you go to a lake, as long as the wind isn't gale force, you can fish it. Whereas at the sea, you've got the tides. So every six and a quarter hours, the tide goes from high tide to low tide, and then the next 6 and a quarter hours, roughly, it'll go back from low tide to high tide.
Yeah,
and then those tides themselves vary with the moon phase. So you get neap and spring tides. Neap's when it's at half moon, and the tide doesn't move that much, and generally the fish aren't as active. Whereas on the spring tides, where especially on Gower, you get a variation of up to 14 metres. So you get a lot of ground which is exposed for fish to come and forage, especially on the incoming tide. So you've got to understand tides. So your two types of swells are your wind swells, which are localised wind swells. And like today, where we've had a gentle breeze of about 20 miles an hour, it will produce a small, short period wave, which is good for fishing, especially if it's onshore. It can be very good for bass. But you've also got long-range swells. Now, I understand all this from surfing and
I was
watching.
going to say, it's going to be a big help for the surfing.
Watching weather charts. Again, years ago, there were no surf reports. The only weather report you had was the farming forecast on a Sunday, and you'd watch that for low pressures out in the Atlantic. And if there was one there, you wait 3 days, and it'd take about 3 days for the swell to actually arrive on our coastline. And that can catch a lot of people out with fishing on the coast, because it can be a beautiful day, offshore breeze, but there'll be a huge ground swell. And these swells are very powerful, and you need to know all of these factors.
So the area you cover is around your home and the coastline around there. From what region would you say? What area?
Well, I know the coastline in depth from the Gower coastline through to Cardigan, at least on North Pembrokeshire, Cardigan. I've spent a lot of my life surfing, walking the cliffs, studying every area for potential bass or pollock or wrasse or whatever species I want to target, mullet, and each species and each location, I've spent a lot of time studying.
So most of your clients which you take out guiding, are they predominantly fly fishermen, or are they just any sort of, are they spinning or baits? Or
years ago, I used to take a lot more lure anglers out, but I've gone more over to just predominantly fly fishing now. Just purely, it's not one of the things. I've tried to make a living out of it, and realize that because of the conditions, you can't always take someone. So there's a lot of cancellations. And I'm a carpenter, full-time self-employed carpenter, so I can make a good living out of that. And the fishing is a bonus. So if I get a client I generally can be quite flexible, and I work around where the time that they're staying in the area, or if they live here, we can pick a good tide and give them and conditions and give them the best chance of catching.
Yeah,
which doesn't always work, but
yeah,
that's fishing.
Because I've noticed there's probably about the last 10 years, really, there's a massive difference in people who were fly fishing traditionally just for trout.
Yeah,
I've gone into doing more saltwater. The big
Yeah.
thing is bone fishing. A lot of people are doing bone fishing. They
Yeah.
go to Cuba, but there's some fantastic saltwater fly fishing around the coast here. And I remember it was probably 10 years.
got to be 10 years.
Yeah, when I came with you, I think it was probably one of the first trips.
Yeah.
Oh no, we went bass fishing.
Oh no,
That's
yeah,
it.
we went bass the first time. We went St David's area, on quite a trek actually. That wasn't it?
Yeah, that was quite a trek. And I learnt a lesson then, because I didn't realise the terrain we were going to fish. And you were jumping over these rocks, skipping almost, and me and Russell were on all fours. But I had a good escape because I had my camera gear loaded up.
Yeah.
But the weather conditions was great that day.
Beautiful day.
You
yeah.
put us on this spot, and I caught a 2.5 pound bass.
Yeah.
And we cooked it
Yeah,
there and then.
on the beach. Yeah, and there's something about that, and it is wild fishing, and that's something people don't really understand about sea fishing. They think that you just rock up at anywhere and you will catch fish, and it is totally wild. And that's another point you made there about the terrain. It's not just the weather, the tides, the swell conditions.
Got to be fit.
You've got to be reasonably agile and fit, and
And a guide.
and a guide, or with some. And we're lucky today; we've got mobile phones with reasonably good reception. But there are black spots around the coast, because if you do get injured, you could be waiting a long time for someone to come and find you.
And with tides, you could be marooned. I
You
suppose,
could. There are places where you can get trapped quite easily.
Yeah.
In fact, where you caught that bass, I don't know if you remember, I kept going back just to check that the tide wasn't coming in behind us, because there's a gully there, which if it comes in, that's it. We're stranded on a pinnacle until the tide goes back out. But
I enjoyed that, even though I'm not a lover of fish. And funny enough, I think the vast majority of anglers I know, they're not fish eaters.
No.
But it was the experience on that. And I expected more flavour from a bass. Because it's expensive as well. It's probably one of the most expensive fish to have. But I was told by one or two chefs after, I don't know if you can probably
need to leave it. It needs. It's a bit like a good piece of steak. I wouldn't leave it hang for 28 days or more, but leaving it in the fridge for 2 days
tastes better.
It changes the taste completely.
Yeah.
Obviously, fish does go off quite quickly, but bass is like a lot of fish. They do taste better if you leave them a day before eating them.
Yeah.
Mackerel, I think, one species you need to eat on the day, and there's not many people actually have had mackerel straight out of the sea, and there's something really special about that.
Yeah. I remember the last time I came here, actually, you'd caught mackerel in the morning, I think, and we had them for breakfast.
Yeah.
That was nice, lovely.
Yeah. But they're very oily, and they can go off quite quickly, and they become stronger. And some people like that, it's But bass and cod particularly as well. Fresh cod out of the sea, it's completely tasteless. Nothing like what you get in a fish and chip shop.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And if you think your average fish you buy in the fish market, well, it's quite possibly come from the North Sea on a trawler. It would have been put onto ice, and it could be a week before it gets to the shop, and then it's on display for a day, and it hasn't done any harm.
It was a lovely experience, a nice thing to do, and it was great for the feature as well, to eat it there and then.
Yeah.
It did, yeah.
And we caught.
And the next trip I came, it was just a pleasure trip, and we caught pollock and mackerel.
And pollock after pollock, and again, that was a exceptionally good day. And you couldn't put a cast wrong. It was literally every cast, wasn't it? We were pulling in fish between 6 ounces and 6 pounds. It was
Yeah, you had a lovely fish, about
Yeah,
£6.
that was
I couldn't believe it because it was new to me, this pollock fishing, and we were over the kelp and the coastline. In fact, you perhaps remind me of what the area was called, but there was these pinnacles and rocks around the place, and I could have been anywhere in the Med. It was and it was flat calm, and it was evening. Yeah. It was perfect, and we were hooking these pollock, and then you were saying, "Don't give him no line." Yeah. As soon as you hook, that's it. Yeah. And we were having a £1.5, £2, plenty. And then you had this fish about 5.5, 6. And I thought your rod was going to snap. Yeah. You just held it.
The rod was just,
I was waiting for the
most
crack.
of it was underwater, I think. But you can't give a pollock any line. That was a little cove called Pulstrudia, north of Abercastle. And it is a particularly pretty bit of coastline, that. And like you say, it's world class. Yeah, the scenery is world class. Like a lot of places around Wales, whether it's Gower, Pembrokeshire, or this Lynn Peninsula or Anglesey, they're all stunning places on their day. We unfortunately get quite a lot of wind and rain.
I think we were probably lucky that time. Yeah, because another thing I remember, we'd had a fantastic evening, and then we were motoring then on the dinghy back along the shoreline into this cove, and because I was looking over your shoulder, I could see this every now and again, something in the water, disturbance, and I didn't know what it was. And then it wasn't until we got in and the sun was setting, beautiful, I can remember, and we'd come in and we beached the boat, and then I could see what it was. This seal had followed us all the way in, didn't he?
I think they'd learned, because a lot of the fishermen got their fish on the way in. So they're throwing the heads and the guts in. And along with the seagulls, the seals soon realise that if it's a boat, chances are it's going to have a free meal out of it.
And you give him, I got a photograph.
We gave him
give him
a fish. Yeah.
1 or 2 mackerel, didn't we?
Yeah. I wouldn't do that now. Mackerel are a bit scarce, I think they'd be. Yeah. No, sadly, they've declined quite a bit in the last few years. Whether that's due to global warming and temperature changes, or more likely overfishing.
So, as regards seasonal times to fly fish, then for I suppose you predominantly the bass, the mullet, and the pollock. Yeah. So, when would be the best times to fish for those?
Well, funny enough, we're going to hopefully have a little day out on the mullet tomorrow, and they've been around for about a month now in close. I still can't work out where they go offshore. They do go into the havens, and say Milford Haven, into that area, and you will see mullet there all year round. But the big shoals, especially now the water's warming up, we get predominantly thick-lip grey mullet. But the Gower beaches, they get the golden grey mullet, which will take a fly readily. The thick lip are a little bit more tricky to catch, but they're definitely about at the moment. And bass, well, there's not a week of the year I haven't caught a bass.
Really?
There are the bass are around our coastline all year round, but generally the smaller ones are in the winter. Now, there's something else people don't realise. You've got the air temperature.
Yeah.
So you got the air temperature now. In the spring, you can get some very, very warm days, and you think, well, this is it. All the fish will be moving back in, but the sea is on about 3 months behind the air temperature. So the water's still warming up now. We're in August, and it'll keep warming up until almost October. And it won't really start to cool off until around December. So what a lot of people, again, don't realise is that actually some of the best fishing is out of season, October, November and December.
Is it really?
They're actually my bass fishing months, because I like fishing for a lot of species, whether it's coarse, wild trout, rivers, lakes, everything. But I concentrate my bass fishing generally in sort of late September, and October and November is exceptionally good. And the majority of people have pack their gear away, thinking it's the end of the season. But it's nothing for. They do go off to spawn offshore. So from around January, January, February, they'll be going offshore to spawn, and that's the bigger breeding fish. But they won't return then until late April. Some maybe early April, but generally late April, early May, and you can pick up some very good fish then as well because they're hungry. They've come back from spawning, and there's not many big fish out there these days. Although there was this was in, pretty sure it was February this year. Someone cod fishing in the Severn Estuary had a 22-pounder, and thankfully they returned it. And it's something I try and encourage everyone to do, and this really government should enforce it as well. Is that there should be an upper limit, so much as they brought in with the sea trout now. There's a 60 centimetre upper limit for returning breeding fish, basically. And then they should bring in the same for bass. And it's the same size. A 60 centimetre fish is probably reaching 20 years old, and will produce exponential amount of eggs each year. So
I can imagine that must have been great looking fish. 22 pounds.
It is a monster of a fish.
Did you see a photograph of it?
Yeah, I've seen a photograph of it.
Wow.
It looks as big as a bloke holding it. It is an extremely rare fish that size. To see a double figure bass these days or at any time is quite a.
Was
quite
yours
a
on a
fish.
fly?
No. Although the same spot I was fly fishing, and I had an 8-pounder there.
Did you?
So that's and with the fly, again, it's not something to do all of the time. I tend to fish the best method on the day, and it doesn't matter where I'm fishing and what type of fishing I'm doing. I won't just stick at it because it's fly fishing, or if I think lure fishing on the day will be better, I'll lure fish, or if I think bait fishing on the day will be better, I'll bait fish. Because at the end of the day, fishing is fishing, and it's nice to have a day out, but it's also about catching a fish, isn't it?
Yeah.
And sometimes you can just tie a hand behind your back and make it hard for yourself, and actually you could say break the rules. If you're a pure fly fisherman, they might snub lure fishing, whereas I'm pretty broad-minded, really. I think at the end of the day you want to bend in the rod, and
exactly. What about mullets?
Mullet are my nemesis. I've caught lots of mullet throughout my life, up to about 4.5, 5 pounds. In fact, the first one I caught was on Gower, and was actually float fishing mackerel strip, trying to catch more mackerel and garfish. And there's a method of picking up the garfish rather than the mackerel, and that's to slow retrieve your float. And this mullet took the mackerel strip, about 2.5 pound, and that set me off and actually targeting them, but mainly with bread. We even used to snorkel and go out and find where they are in gullies and things, and little coves, and then go and bait it up, ground bait it up, and catch them quite successfully on bread.
Yeah.
And I've had quite a few this year already, even with the lockdown. But it was only last year, really, that I started successfully catching them on the fly. Now, there are lots of people trying, and there are some people who are getting good success. Generally, south of England, it seems to be a stronghold of the mullet fly fishermen, and I've yet to meet anyone else around, particularly in Pembrokeshire, who is actually even trying to target them on the fly. But last year, I started catching them on small streamers.
And are you actually, you're not fishing in the sea as such then?
Yes, you can fish in open sea for them.
Is it?
Yeah, and they're a species which they will turn up in the dead of winter. I don't know if you remember me telling you about looking under the seaweed.
Yes,
looking for bugs and maggots particularly. There's a fly which lays its eggs on and feeds, and the maggots feed on the rotting seaweed rather than flesh. And they look like well, coarse anglers would call them a pinky. They're about half the size of a blue bottle maggot. And if you get the right tide and an offshore breeze, and the tide's licking away at the rotting seaweed, these maggots will float out, and they actually float. They don't sink like normal maggots. And the mullet will go absolutely mad for them.
So you tie them on like 12s, 14s?
Yeah, small flies. I found small streamers, but there are people just by chance catching them on bigger streamers, fishing for bass. And I've caught them fair and square on small plugs and small metal lures as well. Fair, and they've actually actively chased it and taking it.
A success I've only done it a few times. Fly fishing for mullet, and they were just small, basically hare's ears, 14s and 12s.
Yeah.
And what we were doing, we were fishing a tidal stretch down by the Ogmore, and then you would fish. They would come past us. The tide would come up, and you'd see the shoal come past us, and then so you'd probably have a window of half hour at best, probably.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you'd fish, and then once that window's gone,
they've gone.
You're gone. You're going to wait for the tide to come back down, and then you've got another chance.
Yeah. Well, this is what most people are doing. They're fishing tidal inlets, and so they're generally fishing from the first hour and a half of the flood, when they do come in, and they're searching for any bit of whether it's worms or algae, bits of weed, and they come in, and you need to. It's like with any species, you need to understand what it's doing to successfully target them. And I spent many hours watching shoals of mullet and individual mullet and what they're doing, and I've learned that you can spend a lot of time not catching them, because if they're not interested, if they're not actually feeding, it's very hard to induce them to feed. You can with bread. They're most of the time they're quite obliging with bread. But with the fly, if you're just going to use a traditional pattern, particularly, a lot of people are using bread imitation, so they ground bait with bread, and then you cast a bread imitation over the top, which is fair enough, but you might as well use a piece of bread on a float, as far as I'm concerned. But
it's a confidence thing as well, because the species is in the sea. The thought of fly fishing with like 14s, 12s,
and light gear, 5-6 weight rod, and down to a 4 pound leader.
But when they come in, it's like so exciting. You see shows them coming in, and they're rising.
Yes, Some nights I've seen them this time of year, when you get the flying ants.
I saw them last week.
Right. Well, places, some beaches where you have small sand dunes or sandy areas, you're quite likely to get these flying ants. If you get an offshore breeze, they're blown out onto the sea, and they'll actively take them. And the same with the seaweed flies as well. If they're blown onto the water, a small black spider pattern will take them as well. But you've got to spend a lot of time.
I've actually been watching them on the Taff by the Arms Park or the Millennium Stadium now. That stretch there, it is slightly tidal. It comes up by the bridge there. And a couple of times you'd look over the side, depends on the time of the day and the tides and everything. But I've seen them, I mean like 30, 40 of them, and they're all like 2 pound plus fish.
Yeah.
And they come up and then just they go down.
Yeah. There's a little brook, I call it a creek. It's a very small brook which comes into one of my local beaches. And I've often watched them come in there on the spring tides, and they'll come in. And sometimes they get trapped up in the creek, but I've seen fish there to a good 8 pound, and they are phenomenal sport. They talk about this the British bonefish, and there is no question that it is the hardest fighting species in our waters. It would win beat a battle against the salmon hands down, and then that's I've caught a few salmon in my life and a lot of suin. And they're good hard fighting fish, but a mullet takes it to a totally different level, and they do the same acrobatic jumping about as a salmon and sea trout does.
Let's hope we'll meet one or two tomorrow morning then.
Let's hope so. Yeah.
Early start, is it?
Stripping your line down to the backing. That's what I'm hoping for. But
yeah.
No. The tide's not totally critical where we're going, because we are going to actually fish a small creek or lagoon, which is where they get trapped in, and I'm hoping, because we're building up to a spring tide now, and I know that there's some in there, and you're talking there could be 50 to 100 fish in there, and if they're feeding, because this is something I do, much like dry fly fishing on the river, when you're for trout, when you're looking and searching for a feeding larger fish, there's usually plenty of smaller fish just dimpling here, there and everywhere, but if you're quiet and you don't disturb the water and you see a fish rise, you sit back, and quite often I'll spend, if I'm 3 hours on the river, I might have only spent a few minutes actually casting.
Yeah, choosing your time.
Because I'm actually targeting a fish, and same with the mullet. And I tend to just sit back and just watch and see what they're doing, and at some point they'll go on a little feeding frenzy, and then once they're doing that, then it makes your task a little bit easier. Doesn't mean you're still going to get one though.
Yeah, I've noticed that you're a very laid back person as well, and you sit and watch and take time. And I think you telling me a story as well, that you lived by the beach years ago in a house. Yeah, what was the story there?
It was a hut on Gower. My great grandfather built it, or was it my great uncle? Anyway, many moons ago, I built this chalet down in a little bay called Muslade. When I finished college, I was in Swansea University. I'd went to work out on the farms and a campsite out on Gower, and my father was very good and let me live in there, but there was no electric, no running water, no toilet. It was a compost toilet basically. It's a very simple living, and I also was able to surf every day as well, which was
that was a big draw then.
Yeah.
How long did you do it?
Surfing, I've surfed for probably 30 years.
Oh, you lived there?
Oh, that lived probably 3 years.
Was it
on and off?
It?
Yeah, 3 seasons, and winter was pretty harsh because.
And you were foraging sometimes for your food as well?
Yeah, just as an experiment, really. So perhaps go out and see what I could forage. So whether it was pig nuts, which are the sort of root of one of the cow parsley family, and then go down to the shoreline, find some edible crab or a lobster.
Literally?
Literally, and try and live off what I could find. But you soon find out that you burn off a lot more energy finding the food than you're actually getting back from the food. So, you need to go to a shop to stock up on
these or something,
bacon, and bread and beer. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's and I've always strived for peace and quiet. And more recently, someone you need to meet is Alan Parfitt, and he introduced me to the Isle of Hoy a few years ago up in Orkney, and we were chasing the sea trout in the sea there, fly fishing and spinning, and we were very successful at it as well. But it is so quiet up there. It's hard to describe. The bees are almost being too noisy. But I've always strived through my life. It's probably since I had a brain hemorrhage, really. I tend to take life with a pinch of salt. And
when did that happen? What happened there?
We still don't know why it happened, but when I had to have a major operation, lucky actually to be here.
How old are you?
I was 15 when I had the main one, so I missed out on a lot of schooling, and I was in a pretty bad way. But it did change my my attitude to life. I enjoy every minute which I can, and try and spend time with my own family, with friends, and if the weather's good, get out, whether it's up in the mountains, on the river, down on the coast. We're only here for a very short spell, aren't we? And not many people realise it. I started to look at my life and how many trout seasons I've got left, and it's, yeah, I'm not going to stop thinking about that. But yeah,
this one's been a bit of a bummer, hasn't it?
It has. Yeah, we've lost one of the seasons, so
yeah,
yeah.
So we'll try and catch up next year now.
Yeah, yeah. If you've got numbers of fish in front of you, and you'll know from fishing whether it's rainbows, or, or carp or whatever. If there's a number of fish there, you've got more of a chance, not because of the numbers, but because they're all competing for the food. Whereas if it's an individual fish, it can just come along and have a look at your bait or your lure or your fly and think, well, it's got time to analyse it. So this goes along with the mullet as well. An individual mullet is it's just not worth targeting for. Well, it is if you've got the time, but the chances are it'll know you're there. And whereas if you've got 20 mullet together, they let the guard down, and they're all like, well, I'm having that, And
I can imagine. I do a lot of boat fishing, and then when you're fishing down a drift and you see fish rising, you might see about 30, 40 yards down, 2 or 3 fish coming up towards you. When that happens, you know you're going to get one of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you cast your fly, and there's the competition there.
Yeah.
If you see one fish come up, you might be lucky to get him.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
Chances are it's just looking, going, it's not quite right.
Yeah.
But that goes whether it's mullet, bass, sea trout. Although bass, they seem to always be hungry.
More inquisitive, they'll take.
Some of the, because obviously I do keep fish to eat, and I'm not going to stop doing that, even though we have had a couple of years of no taking or limited taking, which is good, and stocks are recovering, or seem to be. But I've used to I gut and scale every fish I catch, and whatever species I've kept, I do like to see what it's been eating, and the same with trout fishing. You'd use a marrow spoon, or and it does help. It can help you on the day to see what they're eating. And bass, I have found anything from strips of plastic to a seagull leg foot, leg and foot, jellyfish, any marine animal or species, bass will eat. They're opportunist feeders.
Right.
And I caught one. It was about £4 a few years ago, and I thought it's got a big stomach on it. I was actually lure fishing. I had quite a big, like Rapala type lure on, and in its stomach, it wouldn't have fitted this size lure in it. It had a 6-ounce mullet in its stomach. It was completely full, yet it still decided that it wanted to eat more. They can be picky some days, but they don't seem to have a limit to what they. So an individual bass, I would say, obviously if you have got numbers, you've got more chance of catching.
And I suppose you got to worry about the fly so much. It's fly pattern. If your fly, whichever you're fishing, it's crossing its path.
Yeah, to them it might be, well, that's just that might be the last thing I see today. I'm going to grab it. But a big fly doesn't necessarily mean big bass. I've caught bass, or small bass, the same size as a fly almost, or a lure. They've got a large mouth on them, and they can almost inhale their own size. But using people seem to think that you've got to use big streamers or clousers, and they've got to be big and leery, and where it isn't true. And the same for pollock. Something almost just a few strands of flashaboo, and it was just literally some dumbbell eyes and a few strands of flashaboo, and it doesn't look much, but in the water and in their eyesight's phenomenally good.
Yeah.
And I found in the last few years I've gone down further down in size, and it doesn't affect what I'm catching. In fact, again,
You tie most of the flies yourself.
I
now.
tie all my own flies. Yeah,
I can just see, because where we sit in now, I could have mentioned this in the beginning. We're in this fantastic room, which is actually you've made built above your workshop, and it's not the set. I wouldn't call it a man cave. If it would be, it's like a 5-star man cave. And you've built it and made it, and I can looking across your shoulder now in the far corner of the room, and you've knocked up this tie-in station which you put together, and it's something. In fact, I got to take a photograph of it later and put it in the story notes go this podcast, because it really is something.
Well, there is a bit of a story behind me having a almost dedicated fishing den.
Is it?
Partly, well, mainly the wife didn't want it all in the house, and then it was particularly with the fly tying. I put mothballs in with the feathers in, and to stop the moths eating the feathers.
And there's a smell, and I've got to be honest, I quite like that smell.
I do, and that feeling, yeah. What was that film?
It's a bit twisted, I suppose. Like
Apocalypse Now. And
Right.
he's on the beach. I love the smell of napalm in the morning, and naturally, anyway, digressing there. But no, going back, there's a reason for having this. When we had a second child, Oliver, who's a really, really keen fly fisherman and angler throughout, and he's very accomplished in his own right. But when he was in his nappies, and I used to have a little fly tying desk upstairs in the house, and one day I could hear Joe screaming downstairs, and she'd taken his nappy off, and in there was a hare's ear, fully dressed, and
in his nappy.
Yeah, I'd gone through his system.
Wow.
And that was it. I was banned from the house with all my fly tying equipment. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
I hope it was barbless.
It wasn't, and it's amazing to think that he'd picked that up off the floor and eaten it, and it'd gone all the way through a mile of intestines or whatever we've got, and it hadn't got snagged anywhere.
Oh, he'd actually gone.
He'd eaten it. Yeah,
it wasn't as if he was just
no,
to
it
slip
wasn't
in
just stuck in there. No, he'd actually.
You're kidding.
No, honestly, it was sticking out of the whatever in his nappy.
Wow.
So
so you were banished up into the
So that was it. Yeah,
your workshop. It really is something else. And I tell you what's nice. I like is you've got lots of photographs. You've probably got about 30, 40 pictures all along the walls. And it's something people don't do anymore. They take their pictures and they're on their hard drive or on their phone.
On their phone, and they just disappear.
And you could be sitting down by your desk there now, tying your flies, your bench rather, and seeing all the pictures there, and it just tells a story.
First ever bass was actually 7.25 pounds, and that was on a very basic 9-foot spinning rod, float fishing with crab. So I'll remember that. That pollock we had with you, that was
amazing. About six,
it was a good £6, but I've had bigger fish, but it wasn't. It was just the moment, and you know, it's.
It was a perfect evening. That was. You couldn't make it any better.
You couldn't. Just everything clicked into place, and
Just
it was
count.
a bit of an impromptu visit as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't planned, and quite often find that whenever you plan anything, whether it's fishing, surfing, expectations take over, and you know the night before you're thinking you're going to get this and you're going to get that, and it never happens. Whereas you ring up the night before, I'm coming down, fancy doing something, yeah, great, we'll go and try and do something. And it generally, whatever you do in life, if you don't try to do it, it generally works out better, and it's more memorable as well, isn't it?
I found my experience when I've been fishing the Corrib, and I got the addiction then for the ferox, and then I was literally 3 weeks at a time. I'd be going there, I'd be out in the lake as early as 4 o'clock some mornings, actually, but more often not, around about 8 o'clock. And I'd be fishing till 10, 11 o'clock at night. Obsessive. Yeah. And I wouldn't miss a day. No. 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time doing that. And then there come a stage then I was successful at it, and I got a few with a big fish. including the record. And then what happened? Everything sort of slowed down then. It was like, right, I've done it. The rest of the time now, any fish got to come in my time.
Yeah.
You haven't got to chase it.
No.
And I think it reaches a point in your life where you do want to slow down, and then you catch just as many fish.
Yes.
What's the saying? Less haste, more speed, isn't it?
Soaking up your environment and you know, again, going back to the fly fishing on the river, and there's a certain extent to the sea, is just sit and watch and observe, watch for birds, watch what everything is doing, and if you're quiet, generally nature, within 20 minutes or so, nature will accept that you're there, and the coastline's no different from a lake or a river, people seem to think that you can just bumble along and wave your arms around and the fish won't mind, but they do, and whether that's a bass or a pollock or anything, sometimes they can be extremely shy and you can spook them. So yeah, no, it's not all about just thrashing the water, is it? It's and whether that is an age thing, I don't know. Maybe when I was younger and I was really fish hungry, I would have.
Yeah, I think I was talking to Tony Davis from Pembroke. He's not far from here, actually.
Yeah,
no. Last week, and he said he felt different after the lockdown. Was it 4 months or something? We haven't been able to fish, and then he said he was out and he was enjoying his fishing, and then he watched a grebe and he stopped fishing.
Yeah.
And he just watched and he realised how much he missed things around him which he took for granted before.
Yeah.
I think lockdown will change a lot of people, especially people who just haven't been out at all,
Yeah.
So are you open to taking bookings now towards
Yes, yeah. I've set up a basic website at the moment. I need some work doing on it, but that'll come in time. All the information's there on saltwater fly fishing Wales.
So as long as the restrictions have still been lifted and no change, you can take bookings now.
Yeah, well, I had a client last week, and again, even with a 2 metre rule, which we have in Wales, there's no reason why you need to be any closer. So there's, as far as social distancing, even 2 or 3 people fishing together is you're still quite a way apart.
Like when you're fishing normally, you don't want to be near anyone anyway.
No, well, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, so I actually would definitely recommend, if anybody wants to go and do fly fishing on the coast around the Pembrokeshire area where you are, it's a must. I wouldn't even consider going without a guide. The times I've been with you are in the areas where, it would be a bit risky going by yourself anyway.
You can't. You will catch bass everywhere around the coastline, and you could go to a harbour and catch a bass, but to get to the better spots, you need to be walking around the coast. So you need to have correct footwear. Really, you should have some sort of buoyancy aid, a self-inflating life jacket, definitely a fully charged radio or phone. Food and water. You can dehydrate very quickly on the coast. People don't realise that you've got the reflection of the water, the sun off the water, and the fact that it's, as you know, it's not easy terrain.
No.
As a crow flies, it might be a mile, but actually to get where you want, you might have to go 3 miles. So there's a lot of safety issues, which is what I not only I give my angling knowledge and what I've learned over the last 40 years or more. It's getting people into the frame of mind and the position that they can go out on their own safely. And of course, like with all angling, you should always let someone know where you are or intend to be, and a rough time when you intend to come back as well.
I'm sure a lot of people will be to experience the saltwater fly fishing, and if they do, I'll put details on the notes below the podcast, or they can get in touch by email, and I'll pass the details on to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Gary.
There's one more question I ask everyone before we wrap up: is where would you want to be to make your last cast?
No, that's a tough one. Now, I'd already decided this with surfing, because I'd be going to Hawaii or wherever to find the biggest possible wave to surf.
Yeah.
And if I didn't make it, I'd be dead. But if I made it, well, I could perhaps have another wave. But as far as having my last cast, it would be for a rising trout on a river, even though I'd love the ocean and the coast as much as I do. The draw of a wild brown trout is still, or maybe a sea trout, so a coastal sea trout.
So 2 casts then you want?
Yeah, I do need 2 casts, and it would probably be up on Hoy.
All right.
But if I was going to be anywhere, and there are some lovely little burns up there with brown trout in as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to be somewhere, it could be on a lake somewhere, but it as long as it was peaceful, quiet, watch the sun go down, that would be
Perfect ending.
that would be a perfect ending. It's not going to happen yet, though.
Well, again, thanks for having me down to your home, and I look forward to having a nice couple of hours fishing tomorrow morning with you as well.
It is tonight, mate.
Yeah. Cheers. Thanks, Ron. Tight
Cheers.
lines. All the best.
Take care.
If this is your first time tuning in, make sure you catch all future episodes by clicking subscribe via the links on my website, castingwithkerryjones.com, or via iTunes or your favourite podcatcher. If you like what you've heard on this episode, feel free to drop me a line via my website. Tell me what you've enjoyed, ask a question, or better yet, tell me what you want to hear more of in the future. And if you're looking for additional tips, tackle reviews or venue information, or just want to see what's been hitting the back of my net lately, search up Casting with Kerry Jones on Facebook or follow me on Instagram. And if you still want more, I'm regularly uploading video content onto the Casting with Kerry Jones YouTube channel, so just check that out and subscribe over there too. Wherever you follow, subscribe, comment or message, I look forward to catching up soon for a good fishing chat. Well, I think that's all for now, so until next time, tight lines and don't strike too soon.